Hello and welcome to today's video analysis and lesson on the beginnings of the Renaissance. The Renaissance, we see a rebirth and revival of culture, of knowledge. Value is placed on education. Information and education is seen as important, and we're being taken out of the dark Middle Ages and into this new era of enlightenment. So what we're going to be looking at in this video is what was the Renaissance, why did the Renaissance start in Italy, who were patrons and why were they important, and who were some of the great patrons and what did they do. Let's take a deep dive into this, shall we? So, when was the Renaissance? The Renaissance started around the year in Italy in the 14th century. Okay, people began to change the way they looked at the world around them. They questioned the old ideas of the Middle Ages and they took a new interest in the achievements of the ancient Greeks and the Romans. The Renaissance lasted for over 200 years, and many historians believe that it was the beginning of the modern world. The Renaissance itself is a French word, it means rebirth. The historians call it this age because it was almost as if the Greeks and the Romans had come back to life themselves. Now, if you watch previous videos on the humanism movement, we mentioned this briefly as well, how humanism was a big turning point here. So, this renewed interest in ancient learning was also known as humanism. Okay, the same word had been used to describe the Renaissance way of looking at the world. Humanism puts human beings at the centre of everything. Medieval people thought that life here on earth mattered less than life in heaven after a person died. People in the Renaissance were interested in all aspects of life on earth. They studied and painted the natural world, and especially the human beings who were part of it. So a common question that is asked is, why does the Renaissance start in Italy? And one of the key reasons here we can see, as illustrated lovely through Assassin's Creed, is Florence itself. So, you had the independent city-states. You had, in the rest of Europe, you had kings and nobles ruled over all the people, but Italy had no overall king. It was divided into city-states, and each city had its own ruler. So the unified Italy that we know only came into existence in the 1870s. Up until then, it was independent states. The citizens were also very independent and were open to new ideas. So you had the idea, if we look at our map, you had the Pope ruling Rome. You had the Medicis, a wealthy banking family, ruling Florence. You had the Forzas, a military family, ruling Milan. And in Venice, the richest families elected a council to run their city. So this independence brought about competition as well. As well as the city-states, you had the influence of new ideas. That trade had brought Italian merchants into contact with people such as the Arabs and the Chinese, who had much more advanced civilizations than Europeans at the time. These merchants brought home many ideas from their travels and became more critical of the old ways of doing things in Europe. You had wealthy Italian cities and wealthy Italian merchants. The Italian merchants were rich. They brought silks and spices from Asia and sold them to the rest of Europe. This trade made them immensely wealthy, and as a result, they had the money to spend on grand buildings and beautiful pictures and statues. There's also the influence of the Greek scholars. So in 1453, around the time of the Renaissance starting, the Turks had conquered the Greek city of Constantinople. The Greek scholars there had escaped Italy, and they brought many Greek manuscripts with them. This made many Italians interested in the Greek ideas as well. And of course, the ruins of ancient Rome and the old Roman Empire in Italy itself. Italy had been the centre of the old Roman Empire. In every town in Italy, as we can see here, there were ruins of old Roman buildings. These reminded the Italians of the achievements of their ancestors. The Italian language is based on Latin, the language of the Romans. So therefore, it was very easy for Italians to read books by Roman writers. Video link that we'll provide there about just the idea of Renaissance men, but also what we have to look at is the idea of patrons. And especially in places like Florence, you have patrons becoming important. So patrons sponsored artists. Patrons drove this movement. So a patron is a person who commissions an artist to produce a work of art. In Italy, at the time of the Renaissance, many people in cities had enough money to become patrons. Florence was the richest city in Italy in 1400. The people made their money from the wool trade and from banking. Florentines were very proud of their city because they were so rich they could afford to pay for the best architects, the best painters, and the best sculptors to make it beautiful. That is where and that is why the Renaissance started. For an example of this, you'd look at the Medicis. And our case study will be Cosimo de' Medici, who lived from 1389 to 1464. Of all the bankers in Florence, the richest were the Medicis. Cosimo de' Medici was the head of the family in the middle of the 15th century. He was a businessman who made a great fortune. he was also a great Renaissance patron. So they based themselves here in Florence. Cosimo admired the writings of the Greek and Roman scholars. He had sent agents around Europe to search monastery libraries for old, forgotten manuscripts. If they found any, they were to copy them, and they carried these copies back to Florence. As a result of these manuscripts, he would then build a library to house them. It became the largest and most beautiful library in Europe. It was also the first public library because it was open to everyone. And this idea of education being a human right and not a privilege starts to grow from here. And again, why Florentine becomes or Florence itself and the Florentinian people become more advanced, more educated, more open as a society and as citizens themselves. He set up an academy where scholars could study these manuscripts, bring in the best and the brightest from all over the world. He would have called this the Platonic Academy after the Greek writer Plato. Because of Florence, look at the pictures that we see here. Cosimo was a great fan of and a great patron of the arts, so he invited artists and inventors to stay in his home and paid them to work for him. He also paid for many public buildings. For example, he would pay a famous architect called Brunelleschi to build the parish church in Florence in the new Renaissance style. The basilica that we can see here on the right hand side, which was designed by Brunelleschi, that has the Church of San Lorenzo with its famous Duomo on top of it. Now, at this time, Florence was a republic. That means the people elected the government. But Cosimo used his money to make sure his friends were elected to the government. That made him the real ruler in a way of Florence. And because of this, he was the ruler of the city for 30 years. He made alliances with other cities. These alliances would have kept the peace between the different states of Italy and allowed trade to flourish there, which is another reason why the Renaissance flourished. And under his rule, Florence would become the cultural capital of Europe. Now, the other interesting thing about how church and state are linked here, especially with Florence, is that Cosimo's grandson, Lorenzo, would take over the family when he was only 20 years old. He was a great sportsman who also would write poetry and loved the arts. Because of this, he was known as Lorenzo the Magnificent. And as we'll see later on, Lorenzo the Magnificent really is just that, as he will support a couple of young artists such as Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci, who we're going to look at in greater detail in our upcoming videos. And what will grow from here with the idea of Cosimo as well, and the idea of religion, is the idea of the popes as patrons. So soon after Lorenzo would die in 1492, the King of France would invade Italy. This would start a war that lasted for many years, and Florence was heavily involved, and its wealth was reduced. After Florence was, harmed and destroyed, the popes became the main patrons in Italy. And the two popes who were the main patrons would have been Julius II and Leo X. And as we will see later on, they also employed artists to build great churches and to make them beautiful with pictures and statues. That's all for today's video on the reasons why the Renaissance began in Italy. We'll talk to you again real soon. Don't forget to subscribe so you can see when the next lesson is uploaded. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.